Ever wondered how an entire city could be built to burn? Tokyo in 1945 was a tragic example. It wasn't just a city. It was a tinderbox waiting for a spark. Most of Tokyo, especially the working-class districts, was a dense labyrinth of wooden houses, paper screens, and bamboo frames. They called it the Paper City, and for good reason. Generations of families lived in homes built with traditional, highly flammable materials. This wasn't a flaw. It was a cultural choice, a way of life that had existed for centuries. But in the context of modern warfare, this beautiful tradition became a fatal vulnerability. The very architecture that defined Japanese life was about to become the instrument of its destruction. Before the firestorm, the Americans tried a different approach: high-altitude precision bombing. The idea was to target specific military and industrial sites, just like they did in Europe. But Japan was different. The famous B-29 Superfortress bombers, flying at 30,000 feet, struggled against unforeseen challenges. The jet stream, a powerful river of wind high in the atmosphere, was far stronger over Japan than anyone anticipated. It threw bombs wildly off course, making precision impossible. On top of that, constant cloud cover often hid the targets. Mission after mission returned with disappointing results. The factories kept running, the war machine churned on, and American casualties in the Pacific continued to mount. A new, more ruthless strategy was needed. Enter Major General Curtis LeMay. He was a controversial figure, blunt and determined to win the war at any cost. Frustrated by the failure of precision bombing, LeMay made a radical decision. He looked at the data, the weather, the architecture of Japanese cities, and devised a terrifyingly logical plan. He ordered the B-29s to be stripped of their defensive guns, armor, and ammunition. This made the planes lighter, allowing them to fly lower, faster, and carry a much heavier payload of a new horrifying weapon: napalm-filled incendiary bombs. The mission was no longer to hit a specific factory. The new mission was to set the entire city ablaze. It was a massive gamble. Flying low and slow over one of the most heavily defended cities in the world, without most of their defensive guns, seemed like a suicide mission. But LeMay was convinced it was the only way to break Japan's will to fight. While American military planners were devising this new strategy, what was life like for the people in Tokyo? By early 1945, the war had been going on for years. Food was scarce, daily life was a struggle, and the threat of air raids was constant. Yet, there was a sense of eerie calm, a routine that had set in. People were tired but resilient. They went to work, children went to school, and families tried to maintain a sense of normalcy. They had experienced air raids before, but they were mostly small-scale and inaccurate. The sirens would wail, they would run to flimsy shelters, and after a while, they would emerge to find a few buildings damaged. There was a dangerous sense of familiarity, a belief that they could survive whatever the Americans threw at them. No one, not the citizens, not even many in the military, could have imagined the scale of the inferno that was about to be unleashed. The city's defenses were tragically inadequate. The Japanese government, facing a desperate situation, promoted a spirit of defiance summed up by the bamboo spear mentality. The idea was that every citizen, armed with even the most primitive weapon, could help repel an invasion. This fighting spirit was meant to inspire courage, but it translated into a disastrously poor civil defense plan. Air raid shelters were often little more than shallow ditches or flimsy household bunkers. Firefighting equipment was primitive and scarce, completely overwhelmed by even small fires, let alone a citywide firestorm. The official advice was for citizens to stay and fight the fires with buckets of water and sand. It was a policy based on national pride rather than practical reality, a plan that would sentence hundreds of thousands to their doom when faced with a firestorm ignited by thousands of tons of napalm. On the night of March 9, 1945, the calm was shattered forever. Over 300 B-29s, flying low under the cover of darkness, descended on Tokyo. They weren't dropping high explosives. They were dropping clusters of M69 incendiary bombs. These canisters were designed to scatter and spew a sticky, flaming gel napalm. They crashed through the flimsy rooftops of the wooden houses and ignited everything they touched. The initial fires, fanned by a strong wind, quickly merged. Individual blazes became a wall of fire, a firestorm. This is a terrifying phenomenon where the fire becomes so large and intense that it creates its own weather system, sucking in oxygen from all directions at hurricane-force speeds. The air itself caught fire. Water in the canals and rivers literally boiled. People who sought refuge there were boiled alive. Those who ran were consumed by superheated winds and flames. Shelters became ovens. In a matter of hours, 16 square miles of Tokyo were completely incinerated. The paper city had lived up to its name in the most horrific way imaginable. The heat was so intense it melted metal and glass. The aftermath was a scene from a nightmare. When the sun rose, it revealed a flattened, smoking wasteland where a bustling metropolis had once stood. The smell of charred wood and human flesh hung heavy in the air. The official death toll was estimated at around 100,000 people, but the true number is likely much higher, with over 1 million left homeless. It was the single deadliest air raid in human history, killing more people in one night than either of the atomic bombs dropped on Hiroshima or Nagasaki. Survivors wandered through the ruins, dazed and unrecognizable, searching for lost family members in a landscape of ash and debris. The scale of the destruction was absolute. It wasn't just buildings that were destroyed. An entire way of life was erased in a single night. For the Japanese leadership, the firebombing of Tokyo was a profound shock. They knew their cities were vulnerable, but they never conceived of an attack of this magnitude and ferocity. The American strategy had shifted from military targets to the civilian population itself. This was total war. The raid demonstrated that the United States had the capability and the will to systematically destroy every major Japanese city. It was a brutal message. LeMay's gamble had paid off in a terrifying way. Over the next 5 months, his bombers would repeat this process, firebombing over 60 other Japanese cities, leading to hundreds of thousands more civilian deaths. This campaign of fire was a critical factor, alongside the atomic bombs and the Soviet invasion of Manchuria, that ultimately pushed the Japanese government to surrender in August 1945. Looking back, the firebombing of Tokyo remains one of the most controversial and devastating events of World War II. It raises profound moral questions about the nature of warfare and the targeting of civilians. Was it a military necessity to shorten the war and save lives that would have been lost in an invasion of Japan? Or was it an unforgivable act of mass destruction? There are no easy answers. It stands as a stark reminder of how traditional ways of life can become unforeseen vulnerabilities in modern conflict, and how the logic of war can lead to decisions of unimaginable horror. The story of the paper city and the firestorm that consumed it is a cautionary tale, a scar on our shared history that we must never forget. Operation Meetinghouse. The night the sky turned red. For months, the American high-altitude bombing campaign against Japan had yielded disappointing results. The precision bombing strategy that worked in Europe was failing against Japan's decentralized, cottage-style industries. General Curtis LeMay, the commander of the 21 Bomber Command, knew he needed a radical new approach. His solution was audacious, brutal, and terrifyingly effective. Instead of flying high, he ordered his B-29s to go in low. Instead of high-explosive bombs, they would carry incendiaries, and their target wasn't a factory or a military base. It was the heart of Tokyo itself, a sprawling city of wood and paper homes. As darkness fell, over 300 B-29 Superfortresses lumbered into the sky from airfields in the Mariana Islands. To fly low and fast, they were stripped of most of their defensive machine guns and ammunition. This was a massive gamble. The pilots were anxious. Flying at just 5,000 to 9,000 feet would put them directly within range of Japanese anti-aircraft guns. They were flying into a city's defenses, armed with firebombs, hoping the element of surprise would be their shield. The lead Pathfinder planes arrived over Tokyo just after midnight. Their mission was critical, to mark the target zone for the main force. This zone was a densely packed residential and commercial area in the Shitamachi district, home to over 1 million people. The Pathfinders dropped their M47 incendiary bombs in a precise pattern, creating a giant flaming X in the heart of the city. This fiery cross was the signal, a terrifying beacon for the hundreds of bombers following close behind. The night was about to erupt. Once the X was established, the main wave of B-29s began their attack. They didn't need to aim for specific buildings. Their orders were to fill in the area marked by the Pathfinders. For the next 2 hours, a relentless stream of bombers unleashed nearly 2,000 tons of incendiary bombs onto the city. These weren't ordinary bombs. They were clusters of M69s, small hexagonal tubes filled with napalm. Upon impact, they would burst and spray a jet of flaming gel that stuck to everything it touched, instantly igniting Tokyo's wooden structures. The initial fires spread with terrifying speed, fanned by a strong wind blowing across the Kanto plain. But what happened next was something even the planners hadn't fully anticipated. The individual fires began to merge, creating a single monstrous blaze. The heat was so intense it created its own weather system, a phenomenon known as a firestorm. Air was sucked into the base of the fire at hurricane-force speeds, feeding the flames and turning the city into a self-sustaining furnace. Temperatures on the ground soared to over 1,800 degrees Fahrenheit. The wind, now a weapon in itself, ripped roofs from buildings and flung burning debris for miles, spreading the inferno faster than anyone could run. For the people on the ground, it was a vision of hell on earth. The air itself was on fire. Everything was burning: homes, shops, bridges, even the clothes on people's backs. In a desperate search for safety, thousands fled towards the Sumida River and the canals that crisscrossed the city. They hoped the water would offer a refuge from the flames. But the inferno was so hot that the rivers began to boil. Those who jumped in were scalded to death. The bridges they tried to cross, made of steel, glowed red hot and then buckled, plunging crowds into the superheated water below. There was no escape. Even the bombers flying miles above the carnage were not immune to its effects. The thermal updrafts from the firestorm were so violent that they tossed the massive B-29s around like leaves in the wind. The planes were blackened with soot, and the crews were hit with the sickening smell of burning flesh, even at an altitude of 5,000 feet. Looking down, they saw a city that was no longer there, replaced by a solid sea of fire stretching for miles. The entire horizon glowed in apocalyptic red. As the sun began to rise on March 10th, the raid was over. But the horror continued. What fell from the sky was no longer just ash. The immense heat had created pyrocumulus clouds, a storm system born from the fire itself. From these dark, churning clouds, a strange black rain began to fall, a mixture of soot, ash, and the unidentifiable remains of what was once a city and its people. Survivors would later call it the Red Snow, as it carried with it the glowing embers that continued to set new fires wherever they landed. The aftermath was staggering. In just a few hours, nearly 16 square miles of Tokyo had been obliterated. The official death toll was estimated at around 100,000 people, but the true number is likely far higher, as countless bodies were incinerated without a trace. Over 1 million people were left homeless. The scale of destruction surpassed that of the atomic bombings of either Hiroshima or Nagasaki in terms of immediate casualties and area destroyed. Operation Meetinghouse was a turning point. It marked the shift to a strategy of systematic urban destruction that would be repeated across Japan in the final months of the war, aimed at breaking the nation's will to fight. Looking back at the firebombing of Tokyo is a sobering experience. It forces us to confront the brutal realities of total war, where the lines between combatants and non-combatants blur and disappear. The event raises profound and uncomfortable questions about military necessity, morality, and the price of victory. The story of that night serves as a powerful reminder of the human capacity for destruction and the immense suffering that war inflicts upon ordinary people. It's a chapter of history that is often overshadowed but should never be forgotten. A testament to the night the sky turned red over Tokyo. The incendiary secret, the science of M69 napalm. To understand the firebombing of Tokyo, you have to understand the weapon that made it possible, the M69. It wasn't just a bomb. It was a delivery system for a revolutionary and terrifying substance called napalm. The name itself comes from its core ingredients, naphthenic and palmitic acids, combined with gasoline. The result was a thick, sticky, gelatinous goo that clung to everything it touched. Unlike regular gasoline, which burns quickly and can be easily extinguished, napalm was designed to be persistent. It was a sticky death. The science behind this weapon was born out of a secret project led by Harvard chemist Louis Fieser. The goal was to create a fire that was hotter, lasted longer, and was nearly impossible to put out. Fieser's team discovered that by turning gasoline into a gel, they could solve a major problem with early incendiaries. Liquid fuel would splash and burn out too fast. But napalm was different. It burned at temperatures exceeding 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit, and its jelly-like consistency meant it would stick to walls, roofs, and tragically, human skin. Water was ineffective against it. In fact, trying to douse a napalm fire often just spread the burning gel even further. The only way to stop it was to smother it completely, depriving it of oxygen, a near impossible task in the middle of a massive firestorm. The design of the M69 bomb itself was a marvel of destructive engineering. It wasn't a single large bomb. Instead, it was a cluster bomb. A large casing, the E46, would hold 38 individual M69 bomblets. Each bomblet was a thin hexagonal steel tube about 20 inches long and weighing just over 6 pounds. It looked almost like a piece of industrial piping. Inside was the napalm gel and a small igniter. The idea was to scatter these bomblets over a wide area. When the main casing opened at a few thousand feet, it would release this shower of incendiaries. Upon impact, a charge would shoot the burning napalm goo out of the back of the tube, like a fiery shotgun blast for up to 100 feet. This design ensured the fire wasn't just concentrated in one spot, but was spread like a deadly disease across entire city blocks. To perfect this weapon, the US military needed to test it. But how do you test a bomb designed to burn down Japanese cities? The answer was as chilling as the weapon itself. In the remote Utah desert, at the Dugway Proving Ground, the US Army built replicas of Japanese and German residential districts. These weren't just crude mock-ups. They were meticulously constructed, using the same materials: wood, paper screens, tatami mats, and building techniques found in working-class Tokyo neighborhoods. They even furnished the interiors with authentic Japanese furniture. They called these haunting places Japanese Village and German Village. B-29s would fly over and drop different combinations of incendiaries, including the M69, to see which was most effective at creating an uncontrollable conflagration. The night of the raid, codenamed Operation Meetinghouse, was a perfect storm of horror. The B-29s flew in low, under 10,000 feet, to avoid radar and ensure accuracy. They came not in a single wave, but in a relentless stream for nearly 3 hours. The first planes dropped their M69s to create a massive X of fire in the heart of a densely populated district. Subsequent bombers then aimed for the center of this burning X, filling it in until the individual fires merged into one single, monstrous firestorm. This created a phenomenon far deadlier than the flames themselves. The firestorm consumed oxygen so rapidly that it created its own weather system, with hurricane-force winds sucking everything and everyone towards the center. This leads to one of the most terrifying aspects of the firebombing: death by asphyxiation. People who had managed to find shelter in canals or open spaces seemingly safe from the direct touch of the flames, suddenly found themselves unable to breathe. The fire was consuming all the available oxygen in the air, creating a vacuum. Survivors described seeing people dying on their feet, gasping for air that wasn't there. In some cases, the heat was so intense that canals and rivers literally boiled, killing those who had sought refuge in the water. You didn't have to be touched by the fire to die. The fire itself changed the very atmosphere around you into something unlivable. It was a silent, invisible killer that accompanied the roaring inferno. When we look back, the Tokyo firebombing represents a shift in modern warfare. It was industrialized slaughter, carried out with chilling efficiency. The goal wasn't just to hit a military target. It was to dehouse, demoralize, and destroy the industrial capacity of a nation by wiping out its workforce and their homes. The M69 was the perfect tool for this grim task. It was cheap to produce, easy to deploy in massive numbers, and ruthlessly effective against civilian infrastructure. The raid on March 10th burned nearly 16 square miles of Tokyo to the ground, killed an estimated 100,000 people, and left over 1 million homeless, all in a single night. It was more destructive than either of the atomic bombs that would follow 5 months later, in terms of immediate death and devastation. The legacy of the M69 and the firebombing campaign is a dark and complex one. It highlights the terrifying intersection of science, engineering, and warfare, where human ingenuity is turned towards creating ever more efficient methods of destruction. It forces us to confront uncomfortable questions about the rules of engagement and the targeting of civilians in total war. The science of napalm didn't end in 1945. It was refined and used extensively in later conflicts, becoming a symbol of the horrors of modern combat. The story of the Tokyo firebombing is a stark reminder that sometimes the most devastating weapons aren't the ones that create the biggest bang, but the ones that unleash the most primal and uncontrollable forces of nature, like fire with scientific precision. A nation stunned, the psychological collapse. In the early hours of March 10, 1945, the skies over Tokyo roared not with thunder, but with the engines of over 300 American B-29 bombers. But these weren't carrying ordinary bombs. They were laden with incendiaries, designed for one purpose: to burn Japan's capital to the ground. In just a few hours, a firestorm of unimaginable ferocity swept through the city's densely packed wooden neighborhoods. When the sun rose, it revealed a scene of utter devastation. 16 square miles of Tokyo were gone, reduced to ash and rubble. The attack, codenamed Operation Meetinghouse, was the single most destructive air raid in human history, claiming the lives of an estimated 100,000 people and leaving 1 million more homeless. But the impact went far beyond the physical destruction. This single night shattered Japan's national psyche, a blow from which the empire would never recover. It was the beginning of the end, a moment that forced a nation to confront the horrifying reality that their homeland, once thought inviolable, was now defenseless against an enemy in the sky. Imagine the psychological shock. For years, the Japanese public had been fed a steady diet of propaganda proclaiming victory after victory. They were told their spirit, their Yamato Damashi, was invincible. The military leadership had assured them that the sacred soil of Japan would never be defiled by the enemy. Then, in one night, that entire narrative went up in smoke. The sheer scale of the destruction was incomprehensible. People who had gone to sleep in a bustling metropolis woke up in a hellscape. Families were wiped out in an instant. The survivors, dazed and disoriented, wandered through a smoldering wasteland that was once their home. This wasn't just a military defeat. It was a profound, soul-crushing collapse of their entire worldview. The government's promises were lies. The military's power was a myth. The feeling was one of utter helplessness and betrayal. The physical fires may have been extinguished, but a fire of doubt and despair was just beginning to burn in the hearts of the Japanese people. They were stunned into a horrifying new reality. A few days after the inferno, A black motorcade moved slowly through the charred remains of Tokyo. Inside one of the cars was Emperor Hirohito. For the first time, the divine sovereign, who was supposed to be a living god, descended from his palace to witness the suffering of his people firsthand. The sight that greeted him was apocalyptic. As far as the eye could see, there was nothing but blackened earth, twisted metal, and the ghostly silhouettes of a few concrete buildings. The air was still thick with the stench of smoke and death. He saw his subjects, their faces covered in soot and despair, sifting through the debris of their former lives. The emperor remained silent, his face impassive, but the tour had a profound effect on him. How could it not? He was witnessing the failure of his military and the obliteration of his capital. The very foundation of his imperial rule was built on the idea of protecting the nation. Now, the heart of the nation was a graveyard. This silent tour through the ruins was a pivotal moment. It was a silent admission of defeat, a tacit acknowledgement that the war was lost. The emperor's silence spoke volumes, echoing the stunned silence of his devastated people. For centuries, Japan had been protected by the divine wind, or kamikaze. This was the belief that, at moments of greatest peril, divine forces would intervene to save the nation, just as they had when typhoons destroyed Mongol invasion fleets in the 13th century. In World War II, this belief was revived. The kamikaze pilots, who sacrificed their lives by crashing their planes into enemy ships, were the modern embodiment of this divine wind. The public was told that this spirit of self-sacrifice would ultimately bring victory. But on the night of March 10th, as fire rained down from the heavens, people asked a terrifying question. Where was the divine wind now? Where was the kamikaze? The bombers flew overhead almost unopposed. Japan's air defenses, once vaunted, were completely overwhelmed. There was no divine intervention, no miraculous storm to sweep the enemy from the skies. There was only fire and death. This failure was a catastrophic blow to national morale. The myth that had sustained the Japanese spirit for so long was incinerated along with the city. If the gods would not protect them, who would? The realization dawned with brutal clarity. They were alone, and their faith had been misplaced. The sky was no longer a source of divine protection, but a gateway for their own destruction. In the immediate aftermath, the Japanese government faced an impossible task: how to control a narrative of complete and total disaster. Their first instinct was to do what they always did: censor. The military authorities immediately clamped down on all information. Newspapers were forbidden from publishing photographs of the devastation or reporting the true number of casualties. The official reports drastically downplayed the damage, referring to the raid as if it were just another minor incident. They tried to frame the victims as heroes who had died for the emperor, attempting to spin a catastrophe into a tale of noble sacrifice. But you cannot hide 100,000 deaths. You cannot hide 1 million homeless people. You cannot hide the smoke that darkened the sky for days. The truth spread not through newspapers, but through word of mouth, through the whispers of horrified survivors, through the endless streams of refugees. The gap between the government's sanitized lies and the horrifying reality people saw with their own eyes became a chasm. This censorship didn't just fail. It backfired spectacularly. It destroyed what little credibility the government had left, breeding cynicism and deep mistrust among a population that was already traumatized. They knew they were being lied to, and it only added to their sense of abandonment and despair. The firebombing of Tokyo triggered one of the largest internal migrations in Japanese history. A great exodus began. Those who had survived the raid, and those in other cities who feared they were next, fled the urban centers in droves. The message was clear: the cities were death traps. People packed what few belongings they could carry and headed for the countryside, seeking refuge with relatives, or simply hoping to find safety away from the bombers' targets. This mass movement of people, called Sakai, was initially encouraged by the government, but it quickly became a panicked, disorganized flight. Trains were packed to overflowing. Roads were clogged with families on foot, pushing carts laden with their possessions. The social fabric of Japan was literally being torn apart as urban populations scattered across the landscape. This exodus completely disrupted the war economy. Factories, which were already struggling with supply shortages, now faced a massive labor shortage as their workers fled. The sight of millions of people abandoning the cities was a visible, undeniable symbol of a collapsing state. It was a vote of no confidence in the government's ability to protect its citizens. The nation was no longer a cohesive unit, but a collection of terrified individuals fleeing for their lives. For its entire history, Japan had been defined by its geography as an island nation. The seas that surrounded it were not just bodies of water. They were a protective barrier, a moat that had kept invaders at bay for millennia. This sense of being an untouchable island fortress was deeply ingrained in the national consciousness. It fostered a unique culture and a sense of security, even superiority. The firebombing of Tokyo obliterated that idea forever. The B-29s flew over the ocean with impunity. The protective seas meant nothing to an enemy that could strike from the air. Suddenly, Japan was just another piece of land on the map, vulnerable and exposed. This realization was a profound psychological blow. The island was no longer a sanctuary. It was a prison. There was nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. The enemy could reach them anywhere, anytime. This feeling of vulnerability was completely new and utterly terrifying. It marked the end of Japan's splendid isolation and the beginning of its forced integration into a brutal new world where oceans offered no protection. The firebombing didn't just destroy a city. It destroyed the myth of the sacred, untouchable homeland, leaving a scar on the Japanese psyche that would last for generations. The war would end a few months later with atomic bombs, but it was on this fiery night in March that the spirit of Imperial Japan truly died. Final reflection: can a nation survive when its capital burns? By early 1945, the war in the Pacific was reaching its brutal climax. The Japanese Empire, once a sprawling dominion, was now fighting a desperate battle on its own doorstep. But surrender? That was unthinkable. The concept of unconditional surrender was alien to the Japanese military code of Bushido, which valued death over dishonor. For them, every man, woman, and child was a potential soldier, ready to defend the homeland with sharpened bamboo spears if necessary. The American military planners, facing the chilling prospect of a ground invasion of Japan, estimated that such an operation, codenamed Operation Downfall, could result in over 1 million American casualties and millions more Japanese deaths. They were staring into an abyss of unimaginable bloodshed. General Curtis LeMay, head of the 21st Bomber Command, was tasked with a grim mission: break Japan's will to fight by any means necessary. The high-altitude precision bombing raids had failed, thwarted by Japan's industrial dispersal and unpredictable weather. LeMay needed a new, more terrifying strategy. He found it in the very fabric of Japanese cities. This leads us to the night of March 9th, a night that would be forever seared into Tokyo's memory. LeMay made a radical high-stakes gamble. He ordered his B-29 Superfortresses stripped of their heavy defensive machine guns and most of their ammunition. This made the planes lighter, faster, and able to carry a much heavier payload of bombs. He then ordered them to fly low, not at 30,000 feet, but at a terrifyingly vulnerable 5,000 to 9,000 feet, right into the teeth of Tokyo's anti-aircraft defenses. And their payload wasn't conventional explosives. It was M69 incendiary bombs, clusters of jellied gasoline, or napalm, specifically designed to ignite the wooden and paper homes that made up the vast majority of Tokyo. The target was a densely populated residential area in the Shitamachi district. It was a calculated move to create a firestorm, a self-sustaining inferno so intense it creates its own wind system, sucking in oxygen and feeding the flames until everything is consumed. At 12:08 a.m. on March 10th, the raid, codenamed Operation Meetinghouse, began. Over 300 B-29s arrived over Tokyo in waves. The initial bombs created a massive X of fire in the heart of the city, a target marker for the planes that followed. Then the real horror began. Thousands of incendiary bombs rained down, turning a city of 7 million people into a sea of fire. The firestorm that erupted was beyond anyone's worst nightmare. Winds of hurricane force, generated by the heat, swept through the streets, turning canals and rivers into boiling cauldrons. People fleeing for their lives were caught in a whirlwind of fire, their clothes igniting, the very air they breathed turning to poison. The temperature on the ground reached over 1,800 degrees Fahrenheit. Asphalt melted, metal warped, and people were incinerated where they stood. In just a few hours, 16 square miles of Tokyo were wiped off the map. Over 1 million people were left homeless, and the death toll, it was staggering. While exact figures are impossible to confirm, it's estimated that in one single night, around 100,000 people were killed and countless more were injured. This was more immediate death than either of the atomic bombs that would follow. The raid was a horrifying success from a military perspective. LeMay had proven his theory. Japan's cities were vulnerable, and their will could be broken by fire. The terror didn't stop with Tokyo. The success of Operation Meetinghouse became a blueprint. What happened to Tokyo was just the beginning of a systematic campaign of destruction. In the following 5 months, LeMay's B-29s firebombed 66 other Japanese cities. From the major industrial hubs of Nagoya and Osaka to smaller regional centers, the pattern was the same. Low-level night raids, massive payloads of incendiaries, and the creation of firestorms. The goal was to cripple Japan's war industry, which was often decentralized into small workshops within residential areas, and to demoralize the population to the point of collapse. By the summer of 1945, much of urban Japan was a smoldering wasteland. Millions were homeless, the economy was in ruins, and the social fabric was tearing apart. The firebombing campaign was a domino effect of destruction, each raid pushing Japan closer to the brink, setting the stage for the final, even more terrifying act of the war. As the fires still smoldered across Japan, a new weapon of unimaginable power was being prepared in secret. The Manhattan Project had succeeded. On August 6, 1945, the Enola Gay dropped an atomic bomb on Hiroshima. 3 days later, another fell on Nagasaki. These attacks, combined with the devastating firebombing campaign and the Soviet Union's declaration of war on Japan, finally shattered the resistance of the Japanese High Command. On August 15th, Emperor Hirohito, in a voice never before heard by the public, announced Japan's unconditional surrender over the radio. The war was over, but the debate had just begun. Was the firebombing of Tokyo, a raid that targeted civilians and created a humanitarian catastrophe, a military necessity, or was it a war crime? This question plunges us into the complex and murky ethics of total war. From one perspective, the firebombing was a brutal but necessary evil. Proponents argue it shortened the war and in the long run, saved lives. The alternative, a ground invasion, would have been a bloodbath of epic proportions for both sides. They point out that Japan itself had committed horrific atrocities throughout the war, and that in a total war, the distinction between civilian and combatant becomes blurred, especially when the entire nation is mobilized for the war effort. General LeMay himself famously said, "If we'd lost the war, we'd all have been prosecuted as war criminals." His statement highlights the grim reality that in war, victory often writes the history books and defines morality. However, from another perspective, the deliberate targeting of civilian populations is a clear violation of the laws of war and basic human morality. Critics argue that Operation Meetinghouse was nothing less than mass murder from the sky. The objective was not just to destroy military targets, but to terrorize and kill civilians in order to break the nation's spirit. They argue that alternative strategies could have been pursued and that the firebombing, along with the atomic bombs, set a terrifying precedent for future conflicts, normalizing the idea that civilian populations could be considered legitimate targets. There is no easy answer here. It's a debate that forces us to confront the darkest aspects of human conflict, where the lines between right and wrong, necessity and atrocity, are consumed by the flames of war. Today, Tokyo is a gleaming, hyper-modern metropolis, one of the most vibrant and technologically advanced cities on Earth. It's hard to imagine that this sprawling urban landscape was once a field of ash and rubble. But the scars of that night remain, both physically and psychologically. If you look closely, you can still find them. Certain temples and shrines, miraculously spared from the flames, stand as silent witnesses. There are memorials, like the Tokyo Metropolitan Memorial Hall and the Center of the Tokyo Raids and War Damage, which preserve the artifacts and stories of the survivors. They serve as quiet, somber reminders of the night the sky burned. Every year on March 10th, memorial services are held. For the survivors, the hibakusha of the firebombing, the memories are as vivid as ever. The smell of burning flesh, the screams, the sight of a city turned into hell on earth. Their stories are a vital part of Japan's collective memory, a warning against the horrors of war that must never be forgotten. So can a nation survive when its capital burns? The story of Tokyo gives us a powerful, and perhaps surprising, answer. Yes, but it is not the same nation that emerges from the ashes. The firebombing of Tokyo and the subsequent defeat in World War II fundamentally reshaped Japan. It led to the end of imperialist ambitions, the adoption of a pacifist constitution, and an unprecedented period of economic growth and democratic reform. The destruction was a catalyst for a complete reinvention of national identity. The burning of Tokyo wasn't just the end of a war, it was the end of an era. It forced a nation to confront the abyss, and then, painstakingly, to rebuild itself from the ground up, transforming into the peaceful and prosperous country we know today. The story of Tokyo is a testament to the resilience of the human spirit, but also a chilling reminder of our capacity for destruction. It's a history that we must continue to study, to question, and to learn from, to ensure that no city ever has to endure such a night again. Thank you for watching. If you found this deep dive into history meaningful, please hit the like button, subscribe to our channel, and share your thoughts in the comments below. What do you think about the difficult questions raised by this event? Let's keep the conversation going. See you in the next video.